in Australia. I've had a very unusual meeting of Buddhism, and I think an unusual life. But mainly, when I was a teenager, I had quite a lot of difficulties, but I still wanted to help elderly people. So I became a nurse assistant, I suppose you could call it. And so my job was to help a man die. And I was only 15, 16 at the time, and I'd never seen the death process ever before. And he was a lovely man, a very thin man who was dying of cancer. He was blind, and in those days I didn't need qualifications, you just needed a kind heart. So after high school, every afternoon after school, I went and looked after him, I helped him toilet, I bathed him, we talked, we held hands. And he always was very grateful of his life. He said he had a lovely wife, he's had a good life. He was very feeble. I could actually pick him up in my arms and put him on the commode and put him back. Anyway, to cut a long story short, he was dying. And just before he died, he sat up in bed and he was looking at some other people in the room. And he looked at them and he said, "Thank you for coming, thank you for helping me." And then he fell back and he died. And I felt at that moment that whatever was moving that body, that energy, didn't die, it just left. And what we were left with was a shell. So you can imagine, as a 16-year-old, I had to put heavy 50-cent pieces on his eyelids so rigor mortis wouldn't set in with his eyes open, and clean the body up and so forth. And that set me on a journey to look for the truth of what is birth and what is death. And I used to ask doctors in the West, and nobody really knew, no one could answer me. So then, by the time I was 21, I decided I'm going to India to find a guru to teach me about the mind, because I figured with my logic, if I wanted to be a teacher or a doctor, I could learn in the West, but no one really understood the mind. And I'd heard that there were gurus in India, and I had a dream that I would meet a guru. So my poor mother and my poor father, I set off for India with an old friend, but it was in the days where there were no telegrams, no telephones. It was really difficult to communicate. But it's another long story, but I ended up in a place called Dharamsala, where the Tibetan community was. And all the people had gone away to listen to His Holiness's teachings. And I was left with this Lama, who I heard was very ill. So because I was a nurse and I liked helping old people, I went to visit him and I asked him, "Can I look after you?" And he said, "No, but how about you visit me every day?" So this is all through his translator. And finally, after about 3 or 4 months, he said, "Why don't you come to my teachings?" And I said, "No, thank you, I'm not very interested in that." He said, "Maybe just come once." And I thought, oh, he's an old man, I'll just please him and I'll come just once. Well, let me tell you, he made it very obvious he could read my mind, because he answered all the questions about when a person dies, what happens to a person's consciousness. And because I experienced it, it made sense. Instantly it made sense. I didn't have any doubt. And from that moment onwards, for 4.5 years, I listened to his teachings. I found it fascinating. I forgot to go back home to Australia. So this was my very first introduction to Buddhism. And eventually my stories unfolded, but that is the pivotal point that made a lot of sense to me, because I never found that I fitted into Western society. And now I understand I must have listened to Buddhist philosophy in the past because it just resonated so deeply within me. So I became a Buddhist. I took refuge with this teacher, and ever since, wherever I go, I've been closely linked with Tibetans. When I first went back to Australia, I was married and pregnant with my son. I married a Tibetan man, and so when I first came back to Australia, he represented 50% of the Tibetan population, which meant there was only one other Tibetan in the whole of Australia in 1979. So from there, the community has grown greatly, and so this is my connection with Tibetan Buddhism. I had tried in the past transcendental meditation, which I found a bit difficult because it wasn't a teaching that was individually stylised to suit the person's mind. It was the same teaching given to many students. So I found some difficulties in accepting that. I went then to Chan Buddhism, which is Chinese meditation, but because I couldn't understand the Chinese language and I was the only Western person interested in it, that had its difficulties as well. So I guess I kept trying until I found something that I could validate within my own experiences of life, because I don't think you should accept religion blindly. And I think a lot of people in the West are looking for meaning in their life and spirituality, and I think a lot of people accept things blindly sometimes without checking carefully. And I must say I'm very, very lucky. When I went to India at 21, I was not murdered, my passport wasn't stolen, I didn't end up in some sort of false cult. I was very lucky to meet a genuine, perfect teacher. So, very lucky. So that's sort of the beginning of my adventures. So I hope that's been helpful.
That's wonderful, Jenny. And I just wanted to ask, that was so striking when you said that your husband was the only Tibetan in Australia at one point in time. How has your family been able to address the question of a bicultural family in a Western, basically Western nation like Australia? I mean, I realize there are deep indigenous cultures within Australia, but has that been difficult for your family?
Well, in the beginning, during that time, there were very few Western women holding hands with Asian men. And so we got a lot of looks, and I always thought it was because, maybe I wasn't dressed nicely or something like that. But in hindsight, it was probably people were quite shocked to see a Western woman fall in love with what they called an Asian man. In my eyes, he was just Sewong, that was his name. So people asked, what's it like being married to a Tibetan man? But he was just a man. I just saw him as a unique person. The Tibetanness did have its challenges. I always saw us as I was the nylon mentality moving towards cotton mentality, and he was the cotton mentality moving to nylon. So we never were quite on the same page, because he already had that spirituality. What he was missing was perhaps the material things in life, and I was the opposite. So we did have some communication difficulties. I'm not saying it was easy. In fact, we did end up divorcing, and unfortunately after that he passed away. So he had a very sad story. This was a man who had escaped from Tibet when he was 7 years of age. It took his family 8 months to walk out of Tibet. The Chinese were persecuting them. They were trying to kill all the heads of the families. So his grandfather, who was the head of the family, escaped with him. So he was separated from his mother and father and brothers and sisters, which would have been incredibly traumatic. He escaped into India, where his grandmother died at the border from the heat, and his grandfather, who was so overcome with the loss of his wife, put him in an orphanage and left him there until he finished grieving, and then came back and put him in a monastery, believing that a monastic life was the best upbringing for him. So as you can imagine, when I met him, he had all sorts of difficulties, and I was very young in those days, and I was wondering, is it better to help a lot of Tibetans a little bit, or to help one Tibetan a lot? So I decided to help him get a better life, and this perhaps may not have been the best basis for a good marriage. So, but whatever it is, we had a beautiful son, and my son's name is Tenzin Rigdrol Sawang. He was named by the Dalai Lama, so I can't tell you how difficult it was for me not being able to name my son for 3 months, because we were waiting for a letter from India in those days. And there were certain Tibetan superstitions. For instance, my husband at that time had said, you know, to keep the umbilical cord, because if he was sick, the baby is sick, you can cut a little bit off and give it to the baby. And to my horror, I prayed that my son would never get sick, because I just didn't want to do that. But now there's scientific evidence that this is a good form of medicine. So there were lots of superstition and so forth. But my son, I had thought maybe one day he would change his name to a Western name, but he's very happy with his Tibetan name. And he now has 2 children who look slightly Tibetan. And as they get older, they lose that Tibetanness. But we were embraced by the Tibetan community. You know, they often described our love for each other as 2 mountains could never touch each other, but the 2 rivers that flowed from each mountain could join. So that's our marriage description. So my son is a sports scientist now. He's very, very keen on sport, and he embraces the Tibetanness within him in his own way. So in the beginning, yes, it was a challenge, but in some ways too, because it was so difficult, we did respect each other, and when we communicated with each other, we really had to make an effort. He had to make a really big effort to understand my English and what I was trying to say, and vice versa. So there was a lot of respect.